Thanks for everyone for being here today. This is quite a great crowd, great turnout. Today we're going to be speaking about the state of the city. It's the last year has been full of a lot of challenges, a lot of difficult times, but it's also presented a lot of opportunities to the city, and we've had a lot of great successes, and so that's a major point of what we're supposed to, or we're going to be going through today, and then also to talk about the what this year, what 2023 is going to present for us, as long as we have anything to say about it, at least. So I'm going to kick it over to John Morrow, our city manager, to run through the presentation, and then I will come back in to do some, as I like to say, color commentary and to answer questions as we go along here. So John Morrow, city manager.
Thank you, Mayor Faber. Gosh, happy Friday. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues, actually, and a few folks that I haven't quite met yet. So thanks for spending an hour with us this morning. Let me just get this. We've got some slides, and let me just warn you, I'm not going to go into great detail in each of the slides, because there's a lot of information there, and I don't think that's the main point, is to get stuck on that detail. But I do want to provide that as some degree of resource for those who want to dig a little deeper. So hence some bullets on those slides that you can kind of pore over. I'll just kind of call out a couple of them as I go through. But I think first off, I think it's traditional. There's just, maybe this is my quick snippet of color commentary. The state of the city. Well, what is the state of the city? I guess in my words, I'd say the state of the city is recovering well. Over the last couple of years, as Mayor Faber has said, I mean, we've had some challenges, and I think using a health analogy, I'll say that we had a surprise diagnosis of a pandemic, but we had underlying conditions that sort of compound on themselves. We had maybe some occasional, and this is not you, I'm speaking about the city as an organization, maybe some poor eating habits, maybe some inadequate sleep, maybe a lack of sufficient exercise. It didn't really put us in the best position to receive that surprise diagnosis. But after that sudden health scare, and recognizing we've let things go a little bit, we've been on a steady regimen. Again, using the metaphor, daily activity, good sleep, balanced diet. And so those pipes and roads and facilities and parks and the other infrastructure you depend on, they need greater attention. And so now that we're on that plan and recovering well, I'd say that we have a positive prognosis for a full recovery. So that's kind of the in my words, snapshot. But let me go through a little bit of, as Mayor Faber said, some of the challenges and lessons learned from this past year, some of our successes, and then our aspirations for 2023. And then we can open up and have discussion and dialogue. So challenges. This is just a snapshot, but we find ourselves with some failing infrastructure. Some things that just happened even recently. Slides and water line breaks and sewer line breaks, and some national news focused on Port Townsend. Some real challenges, I think, for all of us. And I want to, be clear. I'm talking about the state of the city as an organization, but it really does depend on each of you and the organizations you represent, the community you represent, and participate. So this is kind of all of us, and I don't mean to be exclusive. I think there's a vast number of other challenges and other ways to kind of interpret last year. But here's mine. As we learned in the last month or the last week of the year last year, infrastructure unpredictably fails. And when it does, boy, is it just astounding. So, like I mentioned in our prognosis, we really need to start getting ahead. We also learned that recruiting and retaining staff is a challenge. Anybody here, looks like a lot of you who run or work for or lead organizations, my guess is you are facing the same challenges. So we need to use some new tools and new approaches to recruit and retain great talent. Supply chains and labor are still disrupted. We found that at the beginning of the pandemic, but hey, here we are still finding big timelines on materials and labor. We need to be patient. We need to work our timing, and we need to prepare better to anticipate those supply chain and labor disruptions. Sometimes this is a nice problem to have, but sometimes success can actually outstrip our ability to deliver, meaning we just got a lot of grants, but boy, if you don't have an engineer or a project manager to make that happen, you kind of get buried by your own success. So we need to prioritize and be agile to make sure that we don't get sort of buried by that success. Coordinating interest and action on housing takes time and energy. I don't want to speak for all of us, but I can bet either 99 or 100% of us feel like that is a huge pressing problem for our region, our people, maybe ourselves, those we know. So we need to really focus on those levers that really deliver maximum lasting impact. There's always too much to do. And so, of course, really need to prioritize and actually reprioritize in real time. And a couple more, misinformation, bad behavior might be putting it poorly here, but that it causes disruption and division and stagnation. And so really, we need to listen, we need to inform, we need to proceed with some degree of confidence in decision-making, whether it be at the city or your organization. And then I think this is kind of, possibly true for a lot of us here. It's easy to complain, it's really hard to change. And so, refocusing, communicating, and committing to working constructively together is super important. And especially with some of our media friends online here today, I would point out, I tried to speak to that in an op-ed in the Leader just this week. Okay, success. Not a long list here. I'm going to show you a list later, but it's better to do it in photos. So just a smattering of successes here. This is Mayor Faber, Congressman Kilmer, Deputy Mayor Howard, our Public Works Director, at Evans Vista, talking through that $2.5 million in federal funding we were awarded at the end of the last week of the year when the budget was signed into law. Here's us planning for what we could do around housing with housing partners in the community and a number of other agencies at the Intergovernmental Collaborative Group meeting. What if we could turn off the chimes when people join, because that might be disruptive for folks. Here's Deputy Mayor Howard accepting the Municipal Excellence Award for the ICG work that we did. AWC is the Association of Washington Cities. Amy's a board member of AWC. And of course, new staff. We have a new planning and community development director, a new director of Parks and Recreation Strategy, a new finance and technology services director, and a number of new police officers. This Hunter was just sworn in a couple of weeks ago at City Council, that bottom photo. And that's not representative of all the hiring. That's been a real slog for us to get great talent, but boy, is it worth it. You know that for sure. The ICG, like I mentioned before, both virtual and in-person, continues. We meet with Port PUD County elected officials every quarter. Mayor Faber representing at the farmers market. So a shout out for the Jefferson County Farmers Market and being there to engage with constituents on streets, I believe. I think that I put this one right after that. Yeah, this is our bank capacity piece, and Mayor Faber at any time. Color commentary is welcome. We made some funding available in this year's budget to actually start getting a handle on our local road repairs. Like I said, we've let things go, and this is a chance to kind of clamor our way back. Of course, there's a lot of other things kind of represented in the everything from orcas to gingerbread houses here over the course of this past year. We've had a number, not just balancing another balanced strategic budget, but working with partners and winning awards and really making some headway, particularly on things like infrastructure and really working with partners like the Creative District and PT Main Street, on Tyler Street Plaza, the Edge Lane Roads. We got a shout out from the state traffic engineer on that just recently. So that's kind of pictures. I think because I came here, I think both Mayor Faber and I were here last year doing the same thing. We committed to what we might do in 2022. And I think it feels fair to go back to you and say, well, how did we really do? And I'll just top level, I've organized it in 5 slides that are the 5 things we committed, because they're the 5 elements of our strategic plan. And that strategic plan is essentially, now complete. So we're kind of moving to a different framework. I'll explain in a bit, but I think it's appropriate and transparent and, accountable to say, how do we do? These are the things we said literally at the last presentation that we would do this year. And by and large, they are either complete or significantly advanced. Of course, we don't have Evans Vista done, but we have city, county, state, and federal funding, contract in hand, and work in progress, for instance. Of course, Cherry Street, the Carmel building, not done, but we've actually opened that back up to public discussion and workshop at council to advance it. We have a contract, we're getting it development ready, or getting it ready to move to its next phase. And I won't hit all the goals, but those green checks kind of mean they've moved forward, we've been successful. On infrastructure, we've never done a capital facilities plan like we have, so that's a big win. We just finished the Gain Street pump station. We've mapped climate resilience and assets in the way. And then there are a couple of yellows. I'll just say there are some things that we were supposed to start that we didn't, but they're still moving on. So Discovery Road, the $5.5 million, mostly state and federal funded infrastructure project, walking, cycling, and a rebuild of that whole road is advancing. But it's not done. So I'm putting that in yellow. And then a couple of things we just didn't do because, for various reasons. Installing the meters with a mill, the mill wasn't ready. So we're not going to force that upon them. We've got it scheduled later this year. That's okay. We're still billing them for $4.5 million a year, roughly, in our new agreement with them. And then the general sewer plan, not urgent, but we have a sewer plan that's quite outdated, and we need to get on that this year. So that slides into this year's list of things to do. On economic development, a number of folks here we work closely with through the Lodging Tax Advisory Commission, the Chamber to do marketing of Port Townsend, a number of regional partnerships like the North Olympic Development Council. That is how we leverage some of that weight. And as the first bullet says, really the city's wheelhouse for economic development is delivering an infrastructure and renewing infrastructure. The quality of life, the strategic plan element here, a lot of work that has kicked off around the future of parks and recreation, delivering the decision-making on the Sims Gateway project, working through how to operate a failing pool. I'll be very clear, it's failing. It has been failing for decades, but it's still going. And then one thing that we paused and we're resuming now through the Culture and Society Committee is launching a race and social justice or EDI, or I think the acronym is now EAR, Advisory Board on Equity, Justice, Inclusivity Issues. And then finally, the city organization. Like I said earlier, we've hired a number of new staff, including director level leadership. We've been working really hard to keep people here and recruit great people. We've also really wanted to reboot our volunteer program, which is something that we've started to re-energize and relaunch. And then, really it's yellow because we kicked it off at the end of last year. It's not complete, but there's a financial sustainability task force. And I think I see at least one member of that task force on this Zoom meeting that's really getting a handle on what are our priorities, what have we heard from the community on things like parks and streets and housing, and how do we make solid and sustainable advance on those priorities over the coming years. So that's 2022 kind of in a nutshell, and you can go through the bullets in greater detail. And frankly, this is fodder for the annual report that we started doing a couple of years ago, which is more of a glossy, what do we do? There's a list, we've got links, you can hold it in your hands, and we'll be publishing that like every year, the last couple of years at least, in March. So on to this year, what are our aspirations? Just setting the table on the work plan and budget. You can go to the council workshop with a link there. And like Arlene said, this will be up so you can kind of copy that link. You can see the agenda and the materials, which include how we've done last year and what our aspirations are for this coming year. So I'll just give you the highlights. Really, a new framework. And apologies for my color selection here. Hope it doesn't break your monitor. But really just thinking through what are we trying to do over this year and in the coming years. And to City Council and to department directors and I, when we workshop this in July, it kind of comes down to 7 key things, key strategic moves. The first is investing in our people. And these are not in order of priority, but they're all important. The second, engaging our community, and not just like, hey, notifying you that there's a meeting, but really to deeply engage and include people in decision-making, especially those we haven't had a great history of reaching. That's really important. Our financial position, like I said, with the Financial Sustainability Task Force, that is critical because the city needs to endure forever. And we need to make sure we're on absolutely solid financial ground. Envisioning our sustainable future, like I mentioned, especially around parks and streets and assets. Those are decisions that are made, policy decisions by council this year. A number of things on the docket. Actually, it's a big list of exciting decisions that are being made just this year. Embracing and resolving communities' challenges is really a little bit of a throwback to some of the challenges that we've been, kind of working through over decades. Good examples there include things like parking or deer management, delivering the basics, so all the infrastructure stuff that we do, like I showed in the slides, and then really, serving our community. And that last one is all the stuff that really doesn't show up on a slide deck. That's the stuff that we as a city have to do day in, day out. Circulate library books, process permits, do public safety patrols, the stuff that they're not strategic moves, they're not initiatives, but you depend on the city and the city staff to do that every day. I wanted to remind everybody in photos of those policy decisions and kind of exciting vision decisions that the city and our community have on our docket this year. And one is around, kind of from top left, aquatics for our community and our region. Moving to the right, I used Seventh Haven because it's so inspiring. But what are we doing with housing and workforce and affordable housing? What are we doing with our streets? The comprehensive streets program is going to be finished off very soon, and that'll give us some degree of a trajectory forward. And then what are we doing with the golf course in Mountain View Commons? Really pleased to see probably about 400 people engage in open houses recently, both in person and virtually. So big policy decisions, and I hope every single one of you not just engages, but gets your group, your cohort, your friends, your family to engage as well. I won't dwell too much on this because I'll just burn through time, but each of those 7 top line items I just mentioned has another level of detail. And so I wanted to provide that detail to you because it's sort of my promise now to you for next year when we do this. Did we do each of these things? And so around investing in our people, things like an engagement survey and skills enhancement are on our list. On engaging our community, things like how your city works and filling a communications and marketing function are on our list. Strengthening our financial position, we will have the task force report in hand this year, and council can determine whether they want to take action on that report this year. We'll be delivering, a very robust public engagement process around Evans Vista and getting that infrastructure up so it's development ready. Things like golf course and Mountain View, like I mentioned, those are decisions that are this year. I mentioned deer and parking, but also the future of the Carmel building and really work in progress right now around unlocking affordable, dense, quality infill development. On the basics, you can see the list gets a little longer, doing a lot of the main projects, very public works heavy, things like Discovery Road and investing in streets like the 908,000 that came out of the bank capacity. I can handle that in questions, but it's in our budget this year to invest in local streets. And then everything else, this is the kind of short, long list of everything else to serve our community that, is not meant to read because I've made the font size so small, but, like special events and patrol and utility billing and all those kind of things that really just need to happen day in, day out. I wanted to highlight one last thing before I pass it back to Mayor Faber to offer some color commentary. and really kind of take a top level view on facilities, because I mentioned infrastructure for economic development. I mentioned a lot of infrastructure examples. This year, when we did our capital facilities plan, and really top marks to the entire organization who participated, but really Steve King, who led the effort, our public works director. We looked at facilities, parks, water, the Olympic gravity water system, which is that acronym there, transportation, a number of needs that are both funded and unfunded. And we started projecting ahead the next 5-6 years and beyond what the capital need is. And those numbers overwhelm me. I used to be part of an organization that was very small in the greater scheme of things, of a $4 billion budget. But in our community, those are very big numbers. And so you can sort of see at the bottom, what's funded is a small fraction of what our needs are. And that is the case with pretty much every category. So, just as an example, if you look at streets and the first line in the first column, you see $1.867 million. Well, that's great. But that's, again, over 5 or 6 years, includes grants, doesn't include match, and actually is not a lot of money year on year to make investments. Oh, and also includes bank capacity. So almost half of that is this year's bank capacity improvements that are in the budget. So what then? If the need is actually $91 million, then what are we going to do on streets if we only get 1.8 this 5 or 6 year cycle? Reminder, the answer could be from you. And that's why we want to engage with as many people as possible on all of those major policy projects and kind of decision-making for our future this year. So final thoughts, just to kind of seed some questions. I want to ask this group, how do you want to get involved? How can we work together? How do we hear a more diverse set of perspectives from our community? How do we refocus to be constructive instead of destructive? What are your top priorities and why? What do you need from the city to be successful over the long term? What are your aspirations? And then what do you want to see in this presentation next year? And we'll hand over heart, take that into account. I think that's all I have. So Mayor Faber, what did I miss?
Thanks a lot, John. That was fantastic. Just a few things I want to pull back out from your presentation just now. One, on the engagement piece, it's been very exciting to see the way that, John, you and your team have really improved the process of engaging our community over the last year, and really culminating most recently with the golf course open house with, as you said, about 400 people participating. It reminded me of, speaking of banked capacity and the funding that we're using for road maintenance this year, back in 2018, when we had an open house or a town hall in the exact same space to talk about annexation into East Jefferson Fire and Rescue, which opened up that money that we're now using for road repairs. And 42 people were in the room, including members of city staff, members of East Jefferson Fire and Rescue staff, and city council members. So very, very little turnout. And I think that in large part, the success that we're seeing with that engagement is driven by the much more thoughtful efforts, I think, that are going in from your team, John. So kudos to you for that. I'm very excited to see the community really stepping up, becoming engaged in a lot of the issues that are facing our community. And then also in terms of the pool, one of the things I think a lot of people have maybe misconceptions around exactly what the deal is with the pool. The pool is about 90% of an Olympic swimming pool size pool. It is well past its useful lifespan. It's basically held together with duct tape and a dream. And we're doing a lot, or our staff is doing a lot to keep that thing operational. But we really do need to start looking at how we're going to replace that essential community asset. Something that's particularly useful for our aging population, for physical therapy and exercise. So that's one of the things I'm very looking forward to in 2023. And then in terms of streets, I'm glad you brought that out, John, the $908,000 in street maintenance funding. That is unheard of in the time that I've been on council in terms of the money being put into preserving our essential infrastructure here. You know, for years, and I've been on council now for a little over 7 years, every budget, the Public Works Department would request just $100,000 and it would get stripped out of the budget repeatedly for just for lack of funding. And the thinking at the time was $100,000 isn't even a drop in the bucket. We're still losing ground, so why even start? Which I think was not the best idea, but you know, it's exciting to see that we're actually starting to turn the proverbial boat around here, or whatever euphemism you want to use. Though it's, I think, as you noted, John, it's far from what we actually need in terms of funding for to maintain our roadways, which there's some exciting things I think that are going to be coming up this year with council looking at some potential funding streams that we could tap into for actually getting well, eventually ahead on our road maintenance, but at least you know, keeping things from falling apart would be at least a nice first step. And then lastly, oh, and one other thing on the housing, the history there, why it's so bad. A lot of people I don't think understand that back about, I think it was about 15 years ago when Tim Eyman originally ran the $30 car tabs initiative, that gutted state transportation revenues, which was the source. There were shared revenues that came from Washington state to local jurisdictions to repair roadways. When that went away, it was never backfilled. The legislature never started providing us money from another source. So local jurisdictions have never been able to replace those funds that we used to get. So that's why the roads are in, or at least one of the reasons why the roads are in such bad shape. But now, you know, we're working on options locally. And then lastly, housing, the single most important issue facing our city as far as I'm concerned. And one of the tough things is it's an extremely difficult area to operate in and to understand how we operate in that space. Both because there are many different limitations on what communities can do. There's different levels of authority, be it state, local, or even national, in terms of the mechanisms, the levers that can be pulled, so to speak. And then there's also, you know, the concerns about well-meaning but potentially destructive policy that could undermine our goals to make housing more affordable locally. So all of those things we have to navigate very carefully, but also aggressively move forward on them so that we can deliver as quickly as possible some steps that will hopefully open up more affordable housing in our community. So those are just some of the things I wanted to pull out based on what you were talking about, John, and hopefully we're getting some questions here that we can go to.
You can put them in the chat. I think that's Arlene's suggestion here.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, please.
I also maybe, you know, not to tap dance here, but just to invite anybody here, because I mean I think I know most of you, and it's kind of part of what I love about living here. We can have these conversations over time. You know, that kind of iteration of ideas and energy, fusing together solutions. I mean, that really comes from the social dynamics, you know, and just seeing each other at the co-op or whatever it might be. So let's not make this the only time we talk about how we improve the state of the city. We kind of all need to pull together on this one.
Absolutely.
So I'm Mayor and I'm City Manager Morrow. I have some questions that came in from our Facebook group. Great. And so maybe that will help start the dialogue. And I think there's several of them revolving around the golf course. And one of them I think is really good. I was on one of those calls and it was fabulous to listen to what people had to say. And I think what I'm distilling out of the questions that came in was, what ideas did the community have for like taking over that space or enhancing it or keeping it? What were they thinking?
Mayor Faber, do you want to start there?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in there. Yeah, so I mean, I can give some background on why we're looking at talking about the golf course now anyway, which might be helpful, and then go into more specifically answering that question, Arlene. So the golf course question came up as the current operator of the golf course, the lease was coming to an end, and I believe 2020 was when the lease was set to terminate. There was a 20-year lease, and that was coming up on the end of it. And there had been some problems with the relationship between the city and the concessionaire there. And we started to look at, well, what came forward in discussions at council was a desire to look at what does the community actually value in terms of this 58-acre green space in the middle of the city. I mean, it's prime property to be used by ostensibly everyone, or to be used to the, you know, whatever the value of the community is. But we don't know what that is unless we ask the question, right? That's why we're looking at it in the first place now, is that we hadn't gone out in 100 years to say, well, is golfing what people want there, or do people want other things at that location? And so that's, you know, why we started looking at it. But throughout this entire process, I know I've spoken to, and other members of council have spoken to, making sure that maintaining golf on the site has always been one of the options. You know, we have been very, you know, trying to go to a blank slate effectively to look at what is the community value for the next 100 years, the next generations who will come along to live in and use the assets of our community. And so in this process, we've had a lot of ideas come forward from people, from, again, obviously keeping golfing as is, don't do anything different with the land, to converting it into a more open space parkland for everyone to be able to use, to citing some recreational facilities on the site, be it possibly a new aquatic center or pickleball or dog park or walking paths and biking paths, all the way to more intensive uses like performing arts center is one idea I heard, or an amphitheater, or indeed housing construction. These ideas have all come forward from a variety of people in the community, and through this process. Oh, and also, by the way, a combination thereof of any of these things potentially combined on the site, because it is 58 acres. But obviously, one of the concerns is anytime, whatever path we go on with the golf course, this is a once in a lifetime, maybe once in a century opportunity with land like this. We want to make sure we get it right. And so that's what this process is about. So hopefully that answered the question.
There'll be more open houses. I
Yes.
sent links in the chat both to the presentation that was given last week at council. Last week, gosh, I think it was this week at council on Tuesday. It's a slide deck. It's 50 slides, I warn you. But toward the end, the kind of aggregated what we've heard so far is visually displayed, including some of the options that Mayor Faber spoke to. So we're gathering still. We're not kind of doing anything but getting things on the table. I've also noticed, Arlene, I don't want to overstep my role here, but I've noticed some really fascinating questions come into this chat around historic preservation, around housing and roads and financial tools, deed restrictions. You guys are firing away. I love it. So I don't know where you want to start there. If we just start from the top.
Well, maybe you should just finish the one on the golf course, because I think that, and then we could go to the top, the history piece.
Okay, yeah, I do see a question about deed restrictions, and that's something that I kind of failed cogently to explain at the open house as it came up then, and we determined that it's actually rather complex. There are at least 10 separate deeds or pieces of property with different restrictions. Some of them quite old, some of them, are restricted to municipal purposes. Some aren't, they're given, or sold to the city. So we committed to, at the next open house, understanding that and articulating that more clearly, so that people can understand what limitations there might be.
Right. I think that's a good answer. There was a David Enabuski. I don't know if I've pronounced your name correctly there. Hey, all right. So yes, how does what we're doing on things like housing and roads compare to what other cities in our region are doing? For example, what have others done to deal with the decline in road maintenance funds for the state? Great question. This goes to what I was saying before about potentially other steps that we can take to look at other funding streams for road maintenance. One of them that I think is been popular in many jurisdictions is a transportation benefit district. There's a variety of options under the state law for what that looks like. It's basically additional taxing revenue. It can be done either through additional car tab fees at different levels, depending on for different amounts of time, depending on the vote of the people. There's also an option for sales tax, additional sales tax revenues. We're going to look at those through our infrastructure and development committee probably later on this year, and maybe have something back I'm guessing towards the end of the year on that. Though timing is still a question mark for me on that. But my thought and preference would be to look at sales tax so that we can capture tourist dollars who are a major user of our local roads. But yeah, looking at, there's of course pros and cons. Sales taxes are fairly regressive. So there are things that we need to balance out and see what works most effectively. And then in terms of housing, this is like, housing right now is the hot button. We're almost in like Wild West territory in terms of what is going on with housing in different communities. There's a lot of experimentation going on in terms of what are options, kind of undoing, I think, decades of disservice that different rules and different financial and social structures have come to bear on housing. And the proverbial chickens are coming home to roost, and how unaffordable our communities have gotten. So the state's currently trying to take certain action, different cities are trying to take different action, looking at a number of different potential things locally. I have my pretty strong preferences, but we're going to be navigating that. And on February 17th, the City Council and Planning Commission for the City of Port Townsend will be having a joint meeting to talk about some of the initial, the tactical infill to unlock quality, dense, affordable housing in the community, that initial step. But then the big task is probably going to be for our local community looking into the 2024 comp plan update, the comprehensive plan, which has a lot of our more specific strictures that we need to get deeper into to figure out how we can do more locally.
And sorry to make a minor amendment. I think it's February 13th, just so that folks right date. So sorry, Mayor Faber, just want to make that real-time correction there. Yeah.
Very important. I want to be wrong on the date. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Arlene, you or me here, there's a question about historic preservation.
Yeah. In what ways is historic preservation beneficial to or a barrier to the things that the city needs to address, housing, streets, and what new ideas can we use for the space?
Oh man,
this is a tough one. I mean, this really goes when I was talking about values before with the golf course. This is one of those things that can really touch on some deeply held sense of place, sense of community, and so forth. Historic preservation, I think it's important to always, remember our history, be aware of what makes us a special place, but also be willing to change in order to make it work for people, right? If we calcify the city, if we just cast it in amber, we're going, for housing, for instance, we're only going to become more and more of an exclusive place to live. We have to be willing to let some of these things change in order to preserve the city. I think I wrote in a mayor's column, perhaps a little simplistically, earlier in 2022, that sometimes you can either keep the people the same or you can keep the aesthetics of a place, the built environment the same, but sometimes you can't do both. And that's what I think we're really seeing around stuff like housing, unfortunately, that we can keep what it looks like exactly the same, but people are going to have to leave if they can't afford our community. So it's a balance, right? But we don't want to just obviously bulldoze the things that made our city what it is. I mean, that would be a disaster as far as I'm concerned. So, finding that happy balance is always a challenge.
I'll also plus one of the things you said earlier, Mayor Faber, around the transportation benefit district, because I think, thinking about what our assets are as a community, aside from people, I mean, I'd say that is the number one, historic value of this community. It's unique, and it's why a lot of folks either are drawn here to visit or drawn here to live, and will always do so. And so are there creative ways we can get that balance, like Mayor Faber's saying, where the investment in our local road infrastructure, for instance, comes from the very sales that are being made in our community to reinvest in the infrastructure. And I think that's, one of those sort of sweet spots where that might be possible.
Right.
So we have another question from someone. I'm going to distill this. It's a very long question. They love the idea that the mayor and city council are at the farmers market, and they're encouraging you to spend more time visiting businesses in the community one-on-one or in groups, both the mayor and city manager and city council, encouraging them to get more involved.
Yeah, I think, I think we're probably each a victim or our own routines, right? I mean, there's definitely a number of small businesses that I frequent all the time in the community, but I think it's a reasonable request to see me and potentially John and also other members of council getting out and trying to engage more with other businesses. I mean, I'm thinking like my office, my small business, for instance, is in Uptown. So I spend a lot of time with, going to Aldridge's or going to the Uptown pub or going over to Finisterre or going to the taco shop, Green Crow right here. I talk to the owners and workers there every single day. Also, various shops downtown, like the Wine Cellar, one of my favorites. Love Joe Euro. Talk to him all the time. But there are a lot of shops that I do not frequent, and I think it's a reasonable criticism because it's easy to say that we have our door open for people to come in and see us, but the complication is a lot of people. I mean, they're busy. As I think we all are. I'm very busy myself, but I signed up for this job, right? So yeah, getting out and getting into the other businesses in the community that I don't normally pop into. Yeah, I'll take that on board. Thank you very much for that idea.
Yeah, I'll just plus one that and say the same. And I know, David, you're not shy to come to council, and you have. But I think for those who aren't here or do that, I agree. I mean, I'm the same, I get into a routine when I first moved here. It was just, let's get to every business I can. I went to every restaurant for lunch I could and kind of just had a pattern of like getting to everything. I have my private funds, give my holiday gifts to local business to my team, so I really believe in that. But I also say, and this is not an excuse, when the pandemic and all lockdown happened, our routines were quite different. I didn't go into places anymore. And I think, David, your point is a good one because we need to get back into that habit.
Right.
So we have another question in the chat. In terms of engagement and the community and embracing and resolving challenges, have you considered using the Wisdom Council process developed by the local dynamic facilitator? And I am going to mispronounce Jim's name. I'm not sure how his last name is pronounced, so I'm going to pass that on to you, John.
Sure. Mayor Faber, if you want to jump first, I have an answer, but I can.
Sure. I mean, I'm not particularly familiar with the exact terminology here, Wisdom Council or dynamic facilitator. I know Jim a little bit, but I'm not familiar with this concept, or maybe if I am, I'm familiar with it under a different name.
So I've chatted with Jim a couple of times, and I really and including in local businesses where we occasionally just meet, getting our own lunches. So and I think what I've appreciated about learning about wisdom council process is some of the principles. I think because of pandemic and the city trying to be agile around how we engage with people, pretty not polished ways, like our own website, our own kind of designed open houses. I mean, I'll admit it's not always slick. In fact, it's very rarely slick, but we're trying to be improvisational at this time. Some of those principles in my conversations with Jim have kind of come through, and what we've tried to design for better communication mechanisms, better consensus building, and decision making. So I think there's a lot to take on board there. I don't think we have formally, obviously, but really appreciate the comment.
So I think that is the last question in the chat.
There is one more actually
Just came in. Thank you.
I think it's a very, very important question to answer.
Yes. And yes, why don't you go for it? Who's going to take that one on?
I will happily take this one on.
Okay.
Earl Merman, thank you, sir. Is it legally possible to have different property tax rates for non-resident homeowners, i.e. second homeowners? The answer is, under the Washington State Constitution, absolutely not. For better or worse, it is unconstitutional. The Washington State Constitution requires that all property tax be levied at the same rate against the same classes of property. It can't be differential based on where your primary residence is. So the answer is no.
But and of course, I didn't take no for an answer when I first learned that. And so I went to our city attorney, to planning director, public works director, said, okay, how do we get around this? Please, I hope the state legislature or governor aren't listening, but this is a huge barrier for us, I think. And if that were different as it is in other states, that would be a mechanism for us to, for instance, collect revenue from those who have plenty of capital, including a second or third home, and put it directly into affordable housing. Now that we were trying to find ways of doing that, but I've come up empty so far. But let's keep brainstorming.
Though there are just I don't mean to sit on this one too long. There are certain ways that we do collect revenue from people who have their vacant homes here, who aren't being productive members of our community and aren't at least leasing the houses out to people who live here, which is in the form of things like the mandatory garbage collection services, or the water meter charges that we have on our utility bills, that apply to someone whether or not they live here all the time. There's at least a cost that we apply to them so that they help pay for the services that benefit the rest of the community. But and there's some other things, more creative thoughts that I've been trying to work through in terms of alternative ways to kind of get at this complication. But yeah, unfortunately, legally very very prohibitive to have an alternative tax rate for non-residents.
So I have another question that came in from our Facebook group, and that's about a parking challenge downtown, and if there's a plan to in process to work on that issue.
You or me, David? Yeah. So I recognize, I think our last parking plan dates almost 20 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Having been a transportation geek a little bit in my previous roles, like in working on Seattle's parking policy and plan and Auckland's, I know that this is always going to be contentious, and there's at least 10,306 opinions in our population of that number about parking. But I think it's kind of like infrastructure. We've kind of kicked the can down the road for quite a long time. And in order for us to really get a handle on it, we have to know what problem we're trying to solve. And so I will always maintain that we don't necessarily have a parking supply issue. We have a parking management and enforcement issue. And so in our work plan for this year, and with some caveats, is looking at parking policy and really implementing something. What it requires, though, and kind of back to a point that David made earlier, it requires us to know and understand our community and find ways of engaging everybody. Because if you're a business owner, your needs will be very different than if you're working the night shift, or if you live downtown, or whatever it might be. So that is something we intend to go down the path of this year. It's funded partially in the budget, and it's a work plan item. The caveat is we don't have a city engineer currently with the city. That is the kind of person who would be leading this effort and knowing it. Steve King, our public works director, has imminent knowledge in the space, but he's being stretched 1,000 different ways. So the staffing capacity is really necessary to do this well, because if we kind of go down, do it partial on this one, it's just not going to fly. It's not going to get us where we need to go. It's going to be a challenging set of conversations. It's going to require a lot of dialogue. And ultimately, I think it can result in some great outcomes. Like, I don't know, I'll just use one that we worked on when we were in Auckland. You know, we want downtown, especially after regular business hours, we want people to come and dine at our restaurants. We want turnover. And in fact, during the day, we want turnover. We don't want a car to sit in the same spot for 24 hours, because that's productive, you know, flow for people that are, you know, depending on people coming in the front door. There are plenty of mechanisms we could put into place that actually incentivize that, you know, and enforce for that. And we get that outcome. But if we don't agree on what the outcomes are we're looking for, you know, there's no sense in putting down a bunch of enforcement or policies without knowing where we want to get.
Right.
So Siobhan,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. So Siobhan, thanks both of you for this good information and for your hard work, and is asking how the impact of the code changes currently being considered to increase density info have on housing affordability for working people earning 60 to 110,000 a year.
I'm happy to jump in on that. So the answer that doesn't necessarily satisfy is that we can't guarantee that. Attempts to make guarantees of that in places like Seattle, where they introduced a mandatory housing affordability program for upzoning, any additional, like for building a fourplex, for instance, resulted in the number of units that were the sort of smaller, more naturally affordable units being, the development of those being cut in half over the last half decade. That's a concern I have significantly. If we were to allow people to put an additional housing unit on their property, but we then charge them a lot more money to do it, or we require them to do it for below a certain economic level, then we are taxing the production of the most needed housing that our community needs. So this is what I mean when I said before that housing is a complicated issue. Housing economics is extraordinarily complicated. It's not just take an action. We say, you're going to do affordable housing, and then it's built. We can't force people to build it. Instead, we have to find ways to incentivize. And one of the best ways I've been able to find through a lot of my research, reading, talking to experts in the field, is making it actually legal to build smaller units with shared wall construction, shared utility hookups, and all the things that cost a ton of money. The more we can do to bring down the cost of producing housing, the more likely it is that housing is going to be affordable for people at lower strata in the economic spectrum. And by way, just to speak to some specifics, I mean, again, forcing the affordability piece on housing really squeezes the middle of the housing market. We may get some token units at 80% of AMI or 120% of AMI, maybe up to 150% of AMI, but then all the market units get notably more expensive unless we find a revenue source to actually build those units to backfill the additional cost on someone putting the additional housing unit in their yard or whatever. But with that in mind too, this is where the Evans Vista project the city is working on is really instructive, where we are looking to build or partner with people to build up to 150 units of both affordable, meaning 80% of AMI, area median income affordability or lower, as well as workforce housing, 100 units, up to 100 units, which is 120% of area median income or lower. And we've asked the legislature for authority to go up to 150% AMI. So this is when I said before that this area is fraught with complications. And the worry I always have is well-meaning well-sounding policy that actually has exactly the opposite impact on our housing market than what we would want. And that's what I'm very concerned about in terms of any attempt to force a affordability component on small scale light density like a fourplex. Now, I think there's a strong discussion to be made in terms of, or had in terms of what's called inclusionary zoning, mandatory affordability on larger projects like a big apartment building, or for instance, some of the new subdivisions that are going in, such as off of Cook Street or Cook Avenue. I always mix. It's called both at different places. And then Madrona Ridge off of Rainier, just north of the Rainier roundabout. Those are the kind of projects where the economics of housing suggest that it could pencil out and not have a deleterious impact on the middle of the housing market, where the $60,000 to $110,000 incomes that Siobhan is talking about there. It can actually be effective. I mean, I spoke with the probably nation's foremost authority on inclusionary zoning and mandatory affordability, Jenny Schutz, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And she said, really, if you try and do it on a project of less than 50 housing units, you shoot yourself in the foot. It really undermines the creation of exactly the type of affordable housing you're looking to create. So that's where, again, unsatisfactory, it doesn't feel great. But we do have to recognize that we're a complex, organic ecosystem of people with different incentives, different financial levels, and we need to make it easier for more people to do more things to try and address our housing crisis, or we're only going to be serving the people at the high end of the market. So.
If I could just say two quick things about that too. You know, David, it's become, you probably were before being mayor, but kind of a political authority on this. But, you know, to Siobhan's question about some of the things in motion, it's encouraging to me to see some of the dialogue around things like, you know, changing the permit use tables and accessory dwelling units and, you know, duplex, triplex, fourplex, you know, permittability and setbacks and tiny home and manufactured homes. I mean, these are things that are part of that conversation right now that legitimately could drive you know, affordability and provide options and typologies for people. So there's a lot on the table right now for us to kind of collectively wrestle with. I think, you know, so that's encouraging, but this also isn't our only bite at the apple. I mean, I think there's like a quick push now because of some state requirements we don't need to get into in great detail, but there's going to be an ongoing year-on-year conversation. And back to my early point, we've kind of let this go a little bit, and we kind of took our eye, if I could just be honest, it took our eye off the ball, didn't build a ton of units over the course of decades, anticipated a much higher growth rate than we actually got, but didn't get the infrastructure in place. And so I think now we're playing catch up, and it's going to take us more than one silver bullet and more than 1 year to actually get there. It's going to be an ongoing challenge. And I know that my team and I are deeply committed to this. And I kind of want to be no nonsense. We're not going to do the shiny thing that sounds good or feels good or make someone feel like we got to win. We're going to do something that makes a difference. And sometimes that means taking a lot of heat, maybe getting in squabbles that are really distracting us from the work, but it's the right thing to do. And I'm deeply personally committed to that.
We have two more questions, and I think we're not going to take more. We're going to end with these two. The first one would be sort of relevant to this current thread, and that's have much discussion occurred with general contractors directly to their input on working in the Port Townsend area and how that affects housing?
So I speak with contractors all the time, and both in my day job. I'm an attorney here in town. I know quite a few local contractors. I've spoken with them about the specifically about the topic of housing affordability and some of the complexities that come to bear. And you know, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but one of the things that repeatedly comes up is all of the variability in costs that different projects present, and the complexity of rules that they have to jump through, which also adds additional costs, including various, you know, well, yeah. So that's those are the two of the significant components. And one of the things that's come up is the average, or one of the things I frequently talk to people about is the average cost per square foot to produce housing units. The lowest, so I do know one local builder who quoted me about a year ago at $217 a square foot, which was quite low compared to where, it's quite high compared to historically where things were, but it's quite low compared to what I've heard from most other builders. Now that was before the worst of the supply chain issues, but I guess that's also rolled back off again. So I'm not sure where their numbers are now. More recently, I've heard people quote between $350 a square foot and $600 a square foot to produce a housing unit, which do the math on how much it costs to build an 800 square foot house. And this is nothing necessarily to do with the cost of land, the infrastructure, any of the site prep, all of those pieces. This is just the actual construction cost. This is one of the reasons why, if we try and force people into a tiny box where we say you can only produce housing if it's affordable for a certain population, we're going to not be able to produce a lot of the units based just on those variables, those cost variables. And so that's going to then, of course, mean the people who would have occupied those units at the higher end of the economic spectrum will then look down further into the existing housing stock and make all of the housing more expensive locally. So that's the real risk I think there is with being a little too prescribed about what is allowed versus what can be done, unless again we can find a way to incentivize the type of housing that we really want in the community, because obviously we do need and want the type of housing that's affordable to people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. But my concern right now is without a really strong model for that incentive, then we are going to be locking in really harmful patterns of development and housing costs in our community.
And Arlene, I might try to take a stab at that and weave in the last question too, if I can, and just
Absolutely.
say that with some of my closer friends are general contractors here in town, so these conversations are daily. But just to kind of pivot into something else, because there's a question about how we partner with the city and how do we achieve our goals together besides just coming to council. One of the things that comes up from, say, my general contractor friends is, well, what are the amenities that are family friendly and that'll attract and retain the people in our community for forever? And I think that's why I get so excited about some of the conversations around parks, open space, pool, golf course, Mountain View, because they're really kind of a part of the housing conversation too. Because that fulfills a lot of needs of some of those who are swinging a hammer right now and going back and feeding a family. So I just want to link those things together, that some of the desires and the engagement is around those amenities, and then how to get involved. Oh my gosh, like how much time do we have? I know we're supposed to be out of here in 5 minutes, but you could do everything from run for council, which is an incredibly important role that is very poorly compensated and it'll make you very time poor. Just ask David. And it's just, you're basically volunteering for 4 years of pain, because everyone's got ideas and it's hard to make decisions. And so that is a huge amount of service that people do for their community, including the 7 council members now. But it also means having those round the table conversations with people about some of these initiatives, maybe even organizing. Like I used to be an organizer and an advocate. I'm no longer that. I cannot do that. I can't ask people, let's go and have an idea and let's get it to council. I set the table for effective and transparent and equitable engagement. But that's where things start, whatever the passion is. There are ways to volunteer time and resources to the city doing volunteer work. There are boards and commissions open. There's just a ton of opportunities. And if you go to our volunteer website on Engage PT, you can go to citypt.us/engage, gives you a few ideas. Because look, I agree with Carla's point. By the time something comes to council for a decision, it's almost done. It's kind of to the point where there's some dialogue, there's maybe a couple tweaks, but I'm not going to take anything completely half-baked to city council, because that's not appropriate. That's decision-making point. The open houses, the engagement activity around, say, the golf course in Mountain View, all that work where people are putting stickies down, giving comments, generating ideas, that's the input that will be taken to those decisions. So whatever the issue, there are myriad ways. And if you want more ideas, just send me an email.
Yeah, and just also, by the way, in terms of sending emails, if you don't have time to attend the meetings, you can always email the city council at cityofpt.us. If you have comments to make on any topic, be it on the agenda of something coming up or any other subject that is important to you, that's a great way to reach us. Or you can email in order to be added to, like, you know, the packet for our city council meetings at publiccomment@cityofpt.us. So either way those are great ways to reach council members. I'm also, you know, I can't speak for all the council members, but I'm pretty sure I think they all will agree with me on this, that and again, I think all of them are always happy to have a chat with you. Our phone numbers are public record. My number 360-821-9374. That's my cell phone right here. You can call me anytime you want. I may or may not answer, but you can try reaching out. And I know that other council members try and make themselves available too. So, you know, yeah, please, anything you have to let us know or ask us about, happy to do it.